Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Northwest University, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on a fascinating theme. And I think if you are South African, I have two experts here today to talk about the world that from an academic standpoint, will most probably fall under forensic accounting. But the practical implications and all the practicalities and the cases that we see in South Africa, we see it on so many different levels and fields. So we're going to talk to two experts today, a little bit about money laundering and then also about corruption in a broader sense. But we're going to do it with the idea that to deal with money laundering and corruption when it comes to the future. The two gentlemen we have here in our studio today is right next to me, Dr. Dwayne Aslett. And Dwayne, it's wonderful to again have you here. Dwayne is employed by the Northwest University and does incredible work. I've seen some of his work with his students and also his research and then his work in practice. Dwayne, thank you for availing yourself and being here.
Thank you, Kip.
And then we have Clint Uleman. Clint is a lead investigator when it comes to the Zondo Commission, and as you know, the report is due and we're waiting for a bit of a postponement on the submission of the report. So Clint will most probably be a little bit busy from time to time, but he is a forensic expert. And Clint, thank you so much for your time also participating today.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks.
All right, so in preparation, Dwayne, I got all nervous because I was wondering all those envelopes I got as a young boy from Omar, who gave me some money for my birthday. I now realize that it's never been declared. I got it into the system and it's layered and spent and everything happened. Money laundering is a fascinating field because over time, criminals have come up with so many different ways to launder money.
Yeah.
Let's just first of all start because I'd like to hear from the expert what is money laundering and how it plays out in today's society. Perhaps if you don't mind with a bit of history, where does it come from?
Okay, no thanks. Just coming back to Omar, if she was a drug dealer, you would have been.
Well, Omar wasn't a drug. She did well with cookies.
Okay, yeah, no, that's legitimate income. So tracing back money laundering, the main focus on it as a crime and controlling it dates back, and I'm sure viewers have seen Narcos or one of the Escobars. It's become kind of the flavor of the month a while back. So in that time of the war on drugs that America had with against Escobar and the cartels, etc., the focus became on, these guys are getting money from selling drugs. They don't have a legitimate income in terms of they've got a job that they go to work. So that money that they get needs to be spent. So where's it going?
Mattress.
And on hydraulic lifts that he would lift up and stash the money underneath. The problems got wet and it started rotting. They buried it. They put it in ceilings. There's still stories that there are some flats in America where they ripped down the drywalling and built the walls with money and just wallpapered it in. So he literally did not know where to hide his money anymore. And the reason was he didn't have a legitimate way of getting it into the system. So then we started criminalizing the act of changing that illicit income into it, making it seem like a legitimate income. So just in the way in which we find these transactions, how do we identify them? And that's where the Financial Action Task Force comes in. So that was established by the United Nations. Countermeasures that can be put in place in order to detect and prevent and control money laundering. And that's why when you and I go to the bank, what you hear from them, bring your FICA documents. FICA, Financial Intelligence Center Act, are some of the measures implemented to control money laundering, to identify. When I, as a university lecturer, get a huge deposit into my bank, they're going to say, well, where's this money coming from? Why is this deposit there? So the bank picks up that there's an unusual or suspicious transaction that gets reported. So that intelligence in following the money is gathered, and there's databases of transactions to sift through, which is the other angle of investigating. So the one angle was infiltration, agents going into the getting that intelligence, the James Bond stuff. And then we have the financial intelligence, the other angle at looking at where's the money going and how can we pinpoint who's all involved in this network. And so over time, FATF has had their, the Financial Action Task Force, which talk about FATF, has had their mandate extended every time to look at, continually looking at the ways in which money laundering can be combated, but also another way of looking at, after they had their 40 recommendations, which said this is what countries need to do to combat money laundering, that was called their recommendations, to see how do countries implement these recommendations. Are they complying? Are they doing the best job that they can do in having legislation in place to curb and combat money laundering and detect money laundering transactions? And it's beyond the topic now, but it's expanded into other areas like terror financing, weapons of mass destruction, tax evasion, etc. But money laundering has been the main thing.
So this task force, is it what, a UN thing, or where?
So it's a UN secretariat, small secretariat based in Paris, but obviously they don't have a huge staffing complement. So when they do country evaluations, like we've been twice, and the last one was 2019, just before COVID hit, they have a panel that comes and evaluate your country, but it's a peer review system. So it's members from other countries that form the panel to cover how you've complied, etc. And there are various repercussions if you don't comply, depending on the severity.
How do these repercussions play out? Because, I mean, we've seen people play around with the international court. They just leave the court, and then it seems if they get away scot-free.
It's not that easy with this, because this is a financial implication. So what would happen is, if you go look at some of the commercial banks, the big ones in the world like HSBCA and those kind of banks, they've had a number of severe penalties from regulators. Into South Africa as well, we've had banks that have had from the Reserve Bank 10 million rand fine, for not complying, not committing money laundering necessarily, but just saying you don't have the things in place to detect and report. If a country does very poorly, other countries could turn around and say, well, we can't trust your systems. We can't trust that when we do transactions with you, that behind that is not some money launderer that's going to get us into trouble, in terms of. So it almost becomes like a boycott, a financial boycott, where we say we don't necessarily want to do business with that country. And of course, as a global player, you want to be in that field. And that banks get into trouble because some of their transactions have flowed through other countries. They weren't diligent in their transactions, and they've allowed those countries' transactions to take place, and then they get huge fines. So it's not a thing that you can simply say, well, we're not going to pay attention, we're just doing our own thing, because it has repercussions in the global market.
So who's responsible for this in South Africa? Does it fall under a ministry or what?
It's under the government, but the main Minister of Finance is the main, role player, because the Financial Intelligence Centre falls under the Minister of Finance, Treasury, etc. So our economy, our business transactions, etc., is under that department. And so, like last year or 2 years ago, when we had the panel, all kind of role players need to appear before the panel to answer questions and give feedback, etc. So from Reserve Bank to Financial Intelligence Centre, academics, law enforcement. So the whole spectrum of entities that can be affected by money laundering appears before the panel to give evidence, so that in the end the report, and our report is imminent, as you mentioned, one of the 2 reports that we are expecting soon. As I understand it, it will be served at FATF plenary, actually at the local Isamlog, which is the regional body of FATF, serve on their meeting soon, so it's due for release. If it's next month, if it's after next month, I'd be surprised. It will be probably in October.
So why is it important? I mean, it sounds like, for me driving home after work and so on, why do I need to take heed of this? Because it sounds like just another report. We've seen so many.
Well, it has a severe, if it's a negative report, it has a severe impact on your economy, because immediately the world takes notice and your kind of shares plummet, if I can, so your economy takes a big dive, as has happened recently with some of the countries around us. where those negative reports have, it's a severe impact on your economy, which is the question, can we afford another hit on our economy?
Yeah.
And that is why it is such an important, it's not something you can simply ignore. It's something that, I know, for instance, the Middle East has had a plenary report recently, which was a little bit negative and taken huge steps to try and rectify, because obviously money flows into Dubai and those kind of areas are important. So they would want to make sure that they are compliant and that countries will want to, do business with that country.
It's like a catch-22. If the report is bad, it's good because some of the issues are highlighted and there'll be actions taken to rectify it.
Yeah, we've got to show that we are giving attention to. So the previous one was 10 years before, 2008, and 3 areas I can highlight that we were found, figures, decision makers, etc. So advisors, etc. So in terms of identifying and monitoring their transactions, that's what we haven't done well with, consultancy fees or those kind of things. Are they really consulting? So politically exposed persons, and there's a list of FATF which defines what is a politically exposed person. We fell short on behalf of someone else to say who is the other person that this one is owning that property for, and correspondent banking. They name names, but there's been a lot of press around issues around, in fact, a bank that's withdrawn from South Africa recently because of that. So those are the 3 areas that I just want to highlight that we were non-compliant on, and we can see what happened in that 10 years. Did we really pay sufficient attention to that? Did we really? And the reason why, in that sense, it wasn't seen as really tragic non-compliance issues. It was 3 little areas that we had to give attention to, but in the end, they turned out to be big faux pas. So this time around, we'll see what they say, what their findings are, and again, that report, you can't ignore it. You've got to, as a country, say, well, if we want to be an international player in the international global market, we need to address these issues, especially where there are glaring non-compliance issues.
I don't know. We'll get back to the specifics later on, but I can't see the system that we have functioning optimally as it is. It feels to me, Clint, as if we're functioning through commissions, like what you've been involved with the Zondo Commission.
Yes.
I don't know. The Zondo Commission has completed its work now, but it feels if we need another one, and perhaps that latches on to the recommendations in this report. I don't know.
Yeah, I think, look, the Zondo Commission is, here we're looking at corruption across the state as well as the private sector and where they merge. We're talking grand corruption. We're talking about politically connected people that are close to people in government, so much so that they shift government policy in a particular direction so that they're able to secure lucrative contracts. And then it gets worse. Then they put compliable individuals, leaders, in inverted commas, in exercise which has been undertaken. Last week, the acting Chief Justice Zondo applied for an extension till the end of the year. But having said that, if you listen to what he says in his application, it's been over a period of 3 years. He's led evidence of over 330 witnesses. So it is a mammoth task that he now has to condense into a report for the President, so the President can consider it, understand the impact of corruption in South Africa, state capture, look at ways to address it, and look at ways to prevent these.
Too broadly defined or too abstract, and now they sit with this massive report, or has the scope expanded, or was it from the get-go this massive, broad scope?
Yeah, so look, if you can take a few steps back, I mean, it goes back to the former Public Protector, Thuli Madonsela's report, where she recommended to the then President Zuma that a commission of inquiry should be established to investigate grander corruption. But it was all linked to allegations of the Gupta family and their association with prominent leaders and their ability to secure these contracts and make a lot of money out of that. When they went, were one element of it. There were a number of other parties involved that were doing something very similar to what the Guptas were doing. So a lot of evidence was led. The Bosasa investigation took up a lot of time at the Commission as well. And there you saw also, not one government department, several. Angelo Agrizzi, the COO, he admitted to the ways in which they would entertain and get close to the fore quite nicely, and you could see that over periods of time these contracts were just extended, and they went from tens of millions to hundreds of millions and then eventually billions. So their values just increased over time. So yes, there was the Guptas were the initial focus, but because the Guptas were also connected to so many different people, those people were also exposed during the evidence that was being led, and obviously the commission was forced to have a look at those allegations as well. And then again, with state capture, there's more than one aspect to it. So you have the securing of contracts, but then you also have the purposeful weakening of the law enforcement agencies. So it extends across the entire functioning of the state, hence the term state capture. So that is why it's important that people can understand the consequences of what has happened now, and make recommendations to the President on how we can do things going forward.
So the idea is still to publish the entire report. It's not as if
Published, and the President needs to take that report, take his time to assess it, apply his mind to it, and then let the public know what...
It'll take some time, I mean.
Yeah. But having said that, I mean, the Commission has also entered into discussions and formalized relationships with the prosecuting authorities. So where they have uncovered evidence of a crime, rather than wait, they have already handed that or started handing that information over to the prosecuting authorities. So that information exchange is happening.
Yeah, so I want to get to the process. I mean, Dwayne has explained now the task force's report and on money laundering and the systems they're on and the impact of that. What are we going to see happen if you look into the future once the report is published? I mean, you've told us now that the President needs to... Again,
I don't want to put the words into the ACJ's mouth. I mean, he has to apply his mind as to what he's seen and what he's heard. Over these 330 witnesses that he's heard. There's also be a change. They want to see a fundamental shift in corruption being permitted, to it being stopped, and action being seen to be taken. There's the old saying, justice must be done, but also be seen to be done. And this is what people are wanting to see. I think it's already being borne out in terms of what has happened now with the PPE tenders. You know, every day with the Zondo Commission being live on TV, we've been able to see the extent of corruption being exposed. The organisations' responses were way more swift, and the outcry was way bigger than what it has been in the past. And that immediately shifted pressure back onto government to act. So I do think that there is this general feeling of fed up. People are fed up. They want to see action being taken. And that's something the President will have to consider. So he's going to have to come up with a firm statement to the public to say, yes, this is what the Zondo Commission has told us. I take these on board, and these are the steps that I want to see taking my government. Because one of the likely outcomes of the Zondo Commission is going to be a lot of finger pointing at the ruling party. The President last week in one of his statements has already indicated that he's expecting the ANC to come under a lot of criticism from Zondo over the investigations that he's done. So those are the types of things that he's going to have to consider, and he's going to have to take the recommendations of the Zondo Commission on board. And if they are serious recommendations, he's going to have to demonstrate why he doesn't want to implement those recommendations. So he's going to have to have understood those recommendations very well and the implications for the country going forward.
I can only assume, I mean, the general pressure is there in terms of corruption. Perhaps in money laundering less so. I think the general public would see it as more or less, in terms of investigation, would be a whistleblower. You need someone to speak out and to say, listen, there's something not right here. In terms of the Financial Action Task Force report, is that something that a system can help with? The protection of whistleblowers or the promotion of the idea? What?
No, definitely, and I think just to add to what Clinton said, that we have the United Nations Convention Against Corruption as well, which we as a country have ratified, and that also places a lot of responsibilities on a government to take steps against corruption, similar to to the money laundering provisions. So when that report comes out, there's going to be an international audience as well that's going to look and say, well, are we going to invest in a country that does not take corruption serious and the compliance with it? So in terms of that, and that also deals with whistleblowing. All these conventions have whistleblower protection in them. So your question on whistleblowing, it's a very important aspect, whistleblowers. There are some countries that actually reward whistleblowers with kind of a commission, bounty hunter kind of philosophy. We're not there yet, but it is seen as an extremely important cog in this whole machine against corruption, and something that needs attention as well.
Yeah, maybe if I can just come in there as well. I mean, no, there won't be any repercussions. There was actually an interesting survey that was released last week by, I think it's called Afrobarometer, where they surveyed, in May and June this year, where they surveyed a number of people across the country, across all demographics. And around about 70% of people surveyed said that if they were to blow the whistle on crime, they would expect to see repercussions. So it doesn't say much for the confidence that we have in our current whistleblowing structures and the PPE tenders. So those types of things are something which we are going to have to address. But it also demonstrates that corruption, money laundering, etc., high-stakes games. The amounts of money that are involved are such that people are willing to take these actions and take other people's lives to secure their positions.
It's weird to see this reality and how it's lined up with what you see. I have to think now. I think of myself as an honest person. If I have to live with the knowledge that I've stolen 20 million rand, I don't know how they do it. How do you get into that person's mind and then try and recover? It's a different kind of person, isn't it? And I mean, you see people like this all the time in your line of work.
From many moons ago. So it is mind-boggling. And I said earlier offline, for me, there's a difference between being clever and cunning, and often the cunningness of people astound you in terms of just how they can figure out. To break it down to a simple explanation is one of the early criminologists, Edward Sutherland, developed what he called the fraud triangle to say, what leads people to commit these kinds of crimes. And the first leg of the triangle is opportunity. So they see there's an opportunity here and they commit crime. The second one is pressure. So I've got some kind of pressure on me to get more money, whether that be just simply greed, or, it's going difficult at home. I've got 3 kids to send to varsity or whatever the case may be. So there's some kind of pressure, rationalization. So an honest person would say, well, I've been working for this company for a long time and I deserve, I've never gotten increases, or I deserved a promotion, I was overlooked, so I can take this bribe to do this because, I haven't gotten my dues. That rationalization depends on the person. Some people don't need any rationalization. They simply, the opportunities there are, I want to do it. So that's just a simple, I think, way of explaining it. But
more you see people get away with it, that opportunity for you becomes bigger as well. So if you as a society or a country or an organization aren't seen to be dealing with corruption effectively, you're opening yourself up to be more exposed to corruption. And people that may have been honest may say, well, why must I do all the hard work and not be rewarded when someone else does 50% of what I do? And look at their fancy SUV they're driving.
Unfortunate momentum.
And a culture. So I mean, I always heard that the Scandinavians were pretty compliant people, and until I visited them, I realized it's actually more than I thought. There's a culture there of simple. We just don't do wrong. We stick to the speed limit. If you've had a drink, you don't drive. So there's little policing necessary in such a where people govern themselves and police themselves and have that kind of culture. In South Africa, we may have moved, and there's, especially as we spoke earlier about the construction business or whatever industry you are in, it might be the accepted norm, and if you want to participate, that's what you need to do. And that's the challenge how we do things. This is not in terms of our culture of how we do things.
Well, one way of addressing it is to change the structure and the systems
and
of
send people
addressing
to jail.
this. We have actually a question here, and ladies and gentlemen, you're more than welcome to pose some of your questions. We'll see it and ask our experts to deal with it. The question is, what is professional money laundering? That we've answered. And have you dealt with it in SA before?
If I understand the question, so I think this is not what we talk about, trade-based money laundering, and this is where someone uses their business to launder money through, mixed with a legitimate. But I think what this question refers to is there's been not a trend, but it's, there are professional money launderers. So as a criminal, you don't have to go and invent your own ways to launder money and to change your illegitimate income into a legitimate income. There are persons who do that for you. So they have already got systems in place and schemes in place. So for a fee, they launder the money for you. And there are actually online services like that where you can literally get an online money laundering service. So you don't have to capacitate yourself.
News24 have been running a series of articles known as the Eskom files, where a number of Eskom officials have been implicated in serious corruption, where they receive massive amounts of sums, some over 10, 20 million rand. The proceeds of their corrupt activities has ended up. So it exists here in South Africa today.
So I suppose getting hold of that accountant is key.
Absolutely.
I mean, in your work as forensic investigators, that's most probably an important person to talk to.
Yes, indeed. And just carrying on from what Dwayne was saying, the nexus between money laundering and corruption is very close, because once you start making a lot of money, you have an official who, let's say, earns R1 million a year, but he then buys a house for 20 million rand. He has to disguise that in some way. So then he needs to find some professional help to do it, unless he is very versed in money laundering himself. But then he needs to find professional help to do that. And they are finding more and more inventive ways to do it these days.
We'll get back to Please explain how effective the use of know your client as a strategy to mitigate money laundering. I have no idea what that is. Do you have any idea?
Fortunately, yes.
Wonderful.
Okay, so KYC was the kind of beginning term that we used when know your client. Who's the client? Is it really GPF van Rede van Oudtshoorn standing in front of me? He has his ID. Where does he stay? He's a lecturer or he's at the university. He gets an income from you. So what's his source of income? What's it going to be used for? So all these know your client, these days we talk about due diligence. So doing the due diligence on the client in order to make sure that what this person, the business this person's going to do with me, for instance, as a bank, is what they say and it's legit and they're not going to abuse me for money laundering. So it's a strategy used to mitigate money laundering, get away with it. We can never know who they are and how much they're laundering. So to try and measure how effective this is, very difficult. What tells me it's effective is that money launderers move to other areas to launder money. So it means that this has become too difficult. My personal theory is that criminals are lazy. That's what they do. They want to work hard for their money. So they're going to take the easiest way out. So if it's becoming too difficult at the bank, I'll find other areas to launder my money through. That's just less cumbersome. So the fact that we're seeing other ways of laundering money tells me that this is effective, the KYC or the due diligence on clients.
Zondo Commission. Was it easy to retrace or what do we call it if you get back the money? Is it in any way possible or is it just spent? I think in money laundering there's a term called smurfing, where they take the larger amount and break it into smaller ones and just make it disappear. What happened?
Yes, obviously I can't go into detail of the use of that money. And then what happened from then on, what sort of assets were acquired over a period of time by these people that benefited so much from state capture. That's kind of where the Zondo Commission's role ends. That where there's proceeds of crime, to see if they can seize those assets and see whether they can recover that money.
So back to my idea of what happens now in future. Isn't this a cycle that, the recovered money can be used to pay for some other commission?
Yes, that's correct. A lot of countries actually work on that system where the proceeds of crime that are taken back or seized by the state are then pushed back into those very institutions which are then tasked with fighting corruption and prosecuting corruption. So that's one of the the areas that I think most South Africans want to see. They want to see that South Africa going forward becomes a country where corruption doesn't pay. So take back the money from the people that have been corrupt or benefited from corruption and make it difficult for them to thrive under conditions where if you do acquire money, you're going to be caught out and that money is going to be taken back and you'll most likely face a hefty prison sentence as well.
But this is not happening in South Africa, right? We don't have that system in place now.
We do have the Asset Forfeiture Unit, which is responsible for that. And they are the Special Investigation Unit as well. They've been in the media quite prominently recently for getting, through their tribunal, getting large orders, some over $1 billion, recovery orders, where they found the large contracts to have been obtained through fraud and corruption, etc. So those contracts have been overturned, and they've received orders to recover money from that. So it does exist. It's perhaps not given as much media attention, but at the same time, there are many people that benefit from corruption. Some of them even go to prison, but when they come out, they still have their proceeds of crime, and they can continue as where they were.
So we have also the criminal asset recovery account, where these proceeds get paid into and that gets reinvested into combating crime. Subject to, if there are victims, they can claim. So if someone has been a victim of fraud, they can claim their losses. But in cases of corruption and drug dealing, etc., there's not really those kind of claims. So that money gets reinvested into combating corruption. I think, as Clint said in the beginning, the kind of the watering down of the law enforcement has impacted on our. So the systems are there, the legislation is there, everything's in place. It's simply the application. We need the capacity, we need more manpower, more expertise to really implement and do this. That's where the shortfall is.
But what about the private environment then? Don't we have so many private forensic investigators? Sorry, Clint, you being one. But I mean, don't we have enough in the private sphere to actually...
Possibility. I think there needs to be better private sector, which the prosecuting authorities or the law enforcement agencies could of how our law is structured in South Africa. The police have a specific mandate to investigate crime, and the National Prosecuting Authority has so that requires us then entering into agreements with the police where we assist them. There'd be costs involved as well under those circumstances. But I think there could be an opportunity to look at how going forward there would be better mechanisms in place to be able to cooperate better with the private sector and use the expertise that are already there in the private sector.
So we're talking agreements, but we're also talking changing the law that would regulate this environment?
Yeah, I think also, but maybe just being more efficient in the way that you work with the private sector and work with private firms, where you need their assistance, where you need their expertise. For example, in the Forensic Science Laboratory, they're facing backlogs which go back years. There could be an opportunity there to work with private labs to see how they could deal with those
reports, both of them focusing on different things. I don't know what to expect. I don't know if the fear of another hit on our economy is seriously enough. Am I too doom and gloom?
I think that's probably how the average South African is that they need the public's help. So they have public-private partnerships, in terms of combating crime, etc. Even to the extent where they allow, we also have it for private prosecutions. But in our case, it's and some cases have been prosecuted, high amounts of cases, where we're talking lots of money, have been done successfully. So it is something that we can look at, is to say, how do we, in my experience that the past few years is that it's kind of almost been public sector or private sector versus the government, taking them to court, constitutional court, and it's kind of been a situation where that kind of thing. So there is definitely space for much more public-private partnerships in dealing with this. And I think, for me, it's the only way we're going to do this successfully, because I don't think the capacity is there in the public sector to deal with this amount of problem that we have, this large problem that we have at the moment. Okay, to come to the reports. I think we've seen that South Africa wants to be a player in the global market and attract foreign investment. So I think we're not going to have really a choice, especially with the FATF report. But also there might be a lot of international pressure, you know, on this, from the Zondo report and the recommendation. As Clint said, if you don't follow the recommendations, you really have to say why in this situation, you know, because this is a big fish, if I can do that analogy. It's not something that can simply be. There's been a lot of focus on it.
Of the report, so it'll be there for the public to digest. It'll be there for civil society. What you were describing earlier is what most South Africans are feeling. We call it corruption fatigue at the moment, because you hear every day more and more corruption and less being done about it. So I think the President has a huge obligation to show that his government is going to deal with corruption once and for all. And like I say, I think the issue of civil society and more of civil society reaction to these types of reports coming out and the pressure they put on government and taking them to court. And not only being successful, but having to have government change decisions that they've already taken. That is going to be something which the government will be wary of going forward as well. So they have to be seen to be doing something about it.
All right, gentlemen, we have another question. Which sectors in South Africa is a higher risk for money laundering?
Personally, you know, South Africa has a rich art culture, and you know, if you think of Gerard Sekoto and Pierre Neefs, and you know, we're talking about valuable paint, not even international artists, we're talking local artists. As I understand from curators in the art industry, there's a lot of interest in works of art from South Africa, African artists. But you know, there's a world. Wealthy people don't want to advertise to burglars that I've got a Monet I've just bought, you know.
Absolutely.
So you know, there's a legitimate reason. It creates an opportunity for criminals to invest in art, you know, take it across border. You know, question is, does a custom official know what that is, what its value is? If you look at a Picasso painting, they would think, "Why? Looks like something my daughter painted," you know. They would say. So it's a world that's ripe for abuse. And as I said, look, you know, for me, criminals are lazy, and that just gives an easy way of. And it's happening that criminals are paying one another with works of art instead of.
We should talk about art now, because I've been thinking, you know, criminals continue to be creative. I mean, they're always trying to stay one step ahead of the investigators and the prosecutors and so on. Where do you see the next field of corruption happening? I mean, for us, it's been massive in state capture, right? So we've seen in contract the new field where we're going to be surprised in.
Look, I think as long as there are contracts which the government is going to give out, so the state is the biggest procurer of goods and services in the country. This year alone, we're looking at about R1 trillion in terms of state procurement that will happen. So that's a lot of money that's being put out to bidders to provide their goods and services to government. So as long as that is in place and the checks and balances aren't in place, the avenues for corruption are limitless. So in terms of getting that right, and as Dwayne was saying, there's a culture that needs to change. So there are corruptors and corruptees. It's not only government officials that are corrupt. Private sector is just as corrupt because they offer the bribes are almost limitless.
And I'm concerned because we've heard the President speak about massive investments in infrastructure development. So in construction, I can just think of all the contracts being put on offer there now and in the future.
Yeah, and we saw this with the PPE tenders as well. You know, there was emergency tenders for a specific emergency, the pandemic, and there we immediately saw soon after those the billions that were announced to combat COVID-19. We saw allegations of corruption coming out, and so much so that we've seen now the Minister of Health has decided to resign over allegations of corruption, etc.
It's wherever there's. I always think of the example. You know, almost exactly 100 years ago, America had the Prohibition, and it created that's where the mafia started, with bootlegging and moonshine, etc.
Absolutely.
Because you can't police it. So wherever there's a lucrative market, and once the Americans realized we can't police this and they removed prohibition, they just moved on to other illicit markets where there's a supply and demand. So wherever there's a market that can be what's the word I'm looking for? Exploited, yes. Yeah. That's where you can have corruption. And while you have a corruptible, institution or decision maker, especially where, we were talking about it earlier. It's one thing to get a tender corruptly, but can I deliver on that tender? And where there's not even the point where we're going to check on how is the construction going? Is it being built? I've done investigations when I was in previous life, where nothing was delivered, but the full amount has been paid.
Yeah.
So
nothing at all.
No. Yeah.
and at least if I'm not saying it's right, but at least if you force the person to do it. So it's a difficult situation.
It's true, and that's why you see such an increase in service delivery protests, because it stems from corruption. Money is paid out for services that aren't delivered. And then it's a double whammy, because those services have to still be delivered and you've got to fork out money again. So you're depleting your funds, which are there to service the community. And that's why the community are now starting to rise up and say, you're not delivering the service.
If you'll forgive me, I find your world fascinating. I don't think I have what it takes to function within your world, but it's fascinating. If someone is interested, how do you start? I mean, if I want to start off now, and I think it's horrible to say, but there's a job market here in South Africa. There's a field. So how do we start? How do we start in school? Which subjects do you need to? Is it only accounting, or which other subjects? How do you then move into the next level? How does that go?
So I always say tongue in cheek, in our world, crime pays. Interestingly, you don't even have to have accountancy at school to study forensic accountancy. You've got to have the proper math and a diversity if you haven't had the foundation at school. So that's not a requirement. And yes, we try and train the clever accountants to go catch the cunning ones. So it's a program designed specifically for forensic accountancy, where you have exposure to, you're an accountant. Let's face that. You're just a certain the investigative, interviewing skills, taking statements, interrogating documents, etc. So that investigative skill that you need, that Sherlock Holmes in numbers. So you get that exposure in terms of holistic approach, in terms of the program, to hopefully have forensic accountants who can go out there and make a difference in this environment.
Yeah, I think the education part is very important. I mean, that's your basis, people as well. People that don't just accept things at face value. They always want to dig a bit deeper and say, why is it that way? Why are we doing it this way? Is there another way, or you don't have? And those are often the people that make the very good forensic investigators and the forensic accountants.
I love the idea of the holistic person that you need. I mean, there's a tech savviness that needs to be there as well. These days with cryptocurrencies and so on, which opens up new worlds for money laundering. But that's an entirely new field. We haven't touched on that today, and we don't have time. So let's wrap it up. Gents, what can we expect from those two reports? Your final thoughts? How do you feel? Is it do we have room to be optimistic?
On the Zondo report side, yes, I do. I think there's a lot of work that's been done. Those that had followed it quite closely will have seen what's been exposed over time. They would have seen that there are clear structural weaknesses which need to be addressed. The fact that we're exposing that, the fact that we've gone through this process and exposing that is already a win. Taking the next steps forward, I do think that we have reason to be optimistic. I think the President has to digest that report. It is going to be a comprehensive report. It is going to make serious accusations. It's going to make some serious recommendations as well. I think the ACJ Zondo is going to spend a lot of time thinking about what are the best remedies to get rid of the situation where we're in, and take the necessary steps forward for South Africa to come out of this state capture environment and create a culture and an environment for the future for us.
And I think, you know, the other report, I think the two sides of the same coin. So the FATF report, I think we're going to have to take some shots. That's my personal feeling, is that we can expect to take a few shots in the report. But to answer your question, I'm very hopeful. I think we as South Africans, we have a tenacity in us. And there are some persons who are saying, you know, that we'll only feel actually next year as well, in 2022. So I think we're in for a rough ride. But as I say, I'm very hopeful. I think we as South Africans, we have a tenacity, and you know, we roll up our sleeves and get involved. And I think that's our hope, is that culture, that side of our culture.
Yeah, thank you.
Dwayne Aslett from the university side, thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you with the university, and we appreciate you. Thank you for the work that you do. And so, ladies and gentlemen, also all the other experts that we have at the Northwest University focusing on forensic accounting. If this is a field that you are interested in, we most probably have the supervisor, the expert available to guide you and to lead you towards a career in forensic accounting. nwu.ac.za. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Do enjoy the rest of your day.